Nice to see you again, Moin. So this week, as I'm sure everyone in India knows, there was a dramatic upsurge in Islamophobia across the country as a result of a major increase in the Indian coronavirus numbers as a result of a meeting held at the Markaz, the Tablighi Markaz in Nizamuddin. Now, many people assumed that this was a Sufi a gathering of some sort because it took place in Nizamuddin, and I think this is just a hook we're going to hang the rest of this discussion on. That the Tablighi Markaz is in fact a major anti-Sufi center. The Tablighis are Islamic reformers, fundamentalist, I think it would be fair to say, but not absolutely non-violent. And they believe strongly, rather like European reformers at the time of the Reformation, in an Islam which is based on the text, on the book of the Quran. And just like 16th century reformers in Europe objected to what they saw as a superstition of the Catholic Church, and urged a return to the text of the Bible, and this was very much part of the new learning of the newly literate Protestant middle class in the 16th century. They wanted to return to the text, and the same is true of the Tablighis, who believe that Sufis have been responsible for encouraging superstition, tomb worship, and generally a backward and irresponsibly non-textual response to Islam. And every time that you go to Nizamuddin as a pilgrim and pass the Markaz on foot, you will find gentlemen with their pajamas slightly hitched up above the ankle, with the very particular long Tablighi beards, urging you very politely but firmly not to go to the Sufi shrine. They say it's a place of superstition, it's tomb worship, it's against Islam, and they invite you to come into the Tablighi Markaz and learn what they say is the true form of Islam. And I think both Moin and I, over the next half an hour, will be, in a sense, be putting the opposite case, that the case for Sufi Islam and for the very positive sides of what Sufism has to offer. We should say straight up front, I think Moin is a Muslim, a practicing Muslim. I am not. I was born a Christian. I'm now in some intellectual land between religious faiths. But I very much admire Sufis. I've seen a remarkable variety of very holy, good, impressive men associated with Sufism throughout my travels in the Islamic world over the last 30 years. And I am very sad to see the way that Sufis are in many ways on the back foot across the Islamic world, from India through Pakistan, through the Middle East, right through to the Maghreb. You find Sufis being attacked for what they believe in. And so, Moin, maybe you'd like to give your position before we go off on our travels, so to speak.
Yes, thank you so much, Willie. Thank you so much for taking the time and being part of this talk. It means a lot to me, to Priya, and Roli Books. But I want to come straight to the core, which needs to be addressed, and which is the lost voice of Sufism in today's day and age. And I was really thinking, how do I put it across in terms of what was this Sufi mind? What was the Sufi mind? And I thought the best way to do this, with your permission and the permission of the viewers, is to recite 3 very short poems from 3 leading Sufi poets of the past. And if that's okay with you, I'd like to recite poems.
So gorgeous.
The first poem is from Rumi, the second poem is from Saadi, And the third poem will be from Dara Shikoh, who was the lost Sufi prince of India. And that, I hope, will give you a little glimpse into the mind of the Sufi, which is so important, because when you try and understand that mind, you will understand how innovative, how curious, and how philosophical it actually became. So the first poem is from Jalaluddin Rumi, and if you would bear with me for a few minutes, I'll recite some of the poems and take you through the contributions of the Sufis in science and mathematics as well. So this is Rumi from his Masnavi, and he says, dance.
Which translation are you reading, Moin?
No, I'm reading it in English. I've translated it from Farsi, so I'm reading it in English. Is that all right?
Your own translation?
Yeah. No, I'm reading the translation of Abri.
Abri, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I read it?
Go for it.
Okay. So this is Rumi, and he says, dance. Dance in the kingdom of the king of the world. At this moment, Sufis are gathering together out of joy, glimpsing an invisible world through my praise. The religion of love is beyond all faiths. The only religion for lovers is him. Anger is the ruler of kings, but anger is my slave. I have beheaded anger with the sword of love. I am a mountain, and he is my foundation. I am a garden, although filled only with dust. For him I have burnt, and burnt. So just a quick little thing about this poem. What Rumi says is, obviously, that the real religion is love. But more than that, he says man can be a mountain. He can rise if his foundation is love of God and not hatred and not fear of God. And then there is another poem from Sadi, which I find absolutely fantastic, because
Could I break in there, Moin, just before you go on to Sadi, to say a little point that before 9/11, Rumi was the best-selling poet in America.
Yes.
And the reason for this was it's an interesting story with sort of positive and negative sides to it. The reason for this was an extraordinary series of translations by a poet called Coleman Bucks.
Yes.
Who worked alongside a Persian scholar. Coleman had no Persian, but was a poet, and the Persian character he worked with was fluent, obviously, in Farsi, but didn't. But wasn't a poet. So there was this sort of two stages of translation. And Coleman was very much aiming at a non-Muslim audience. And in many ways, he took Rumi out of his Islamic context and turned him into the new age poet who appears on Instagram pictures of models to this day. And very much sort of apart from the historical Rumi, who was a mullah in a mosque. He was a teacher of Islam and a doctor of the faith. And one saw this extraordinary thing. Deepak Chopra produced musical versions of Coleman Bucks' poems, which got read by people like Demi Moore and Madonna.
That's right.
And became the background for catwalk models in Versace shows. And this way. So Sufism, I mean, on one hand, you could say this is wonderful because this is, religion reaching parts of secular life which normally would never be touched by religion of any variety. On the other hand, it took Rumi out of what was a very specifically Islamic context, even though he was certainly, preaching for all people, and was very open to his word being heard by non-Muslims.
Sure.
And it put it into a sort of strange, new agey world where Sufism has sometimes remained. And one of the topics I think we should address in the next half hour is the way that, in a sense, Sufism is a far richer but also far less cuddly, and it's not a soft, cuddly toy.
No.
Sufism has a hard philosophical, scientific edge. It also has been used in ways that, in modern perspectives, modern liberal perspectives, are not always as easy to take, like the warrior Sufis of medieval Indian history. And I think we should say straight up that the Rumi that many listeners will have come across is not necessarily the Rumi that is there in the Persian. Anyway, continue. But Arbori, what you read is an extremely inspired and respectable and scholarly translation.
Thank you, Willie. Just to give you the depth of these incredible Sufi poets in terms of what they actually did, Sadi actually put words in God's mouth, and he says that God says, "I was a hidden treasure, and I wanted to be loved, and I wanted to be known, so I created creation. Now you know me." And here what the poet is saying is that even God has a desire to be loved. Even God has necessities. And here, this is an example where the Sufis really take the narrative away from the clerics, and they say it's about love of him. It's not about fearing him. And with that mindset came very liberal thinking, came philosophical thinking, came intellectual stimulation, and that drove them to be curious. And with curiosity came innovation. And I just want to talk very briefly about how innovation inspired two incredible men, Ibn Sina and Omar Khayyam. And if you can give me just 5 minutes, I'll talk to you about how that inspired them. So, equipped with this mindset of being curious, and equipped with this mindset of being people who are not necessarily hindered in by dogmas of faith, Ibn Sina was an incredible genius who was born in Central Asia, and he read Aristotle. Never once did Ibn Sina think that Ibn Sina initially did not start off as a Sufi, but in the end of his life he did. And he wrote an incredible poem which I can quote at some other time. But Ibn Sina also excelled in philosophy of understanding. So Ibn Sina wrote on philosophy. He studied Aristotle and came up with a new concept called existence and essence, and the differences between them, which took him even past Aristotle. But he had a love for liquor. He had a love for wine, and as a result of that, the clergy came down very hard on him. He didn't stop. He went back into the libraries and wrote the most incredible book called the Canon of Medicine. The Canon of Medicine went on to become the Bible for modern-day medicine in the West. So this was another great example of a Sufi mind, which was innovative, which was constructive, and which was most importantly all-engaging. The second person was Omar Khayyam, who was undoubtedly Sufi. He wrote extensive amount of poetries on mysticism. He wrote an enormous amount of poetry which urged man to rise above his modest beginnings. But more than that, Omar Khayyam was a great astronomer and a mathematician, and he married mathematics, science, and poetry together. His greatest time was when he worked in Nishapur and in Merv. And when he came out of those libraries in those incredible cities, he came blazing with knowledge when he came up with the modern day cubic equations. And he came up also with modern day geometry, which actually has its origins now in all the craftsmanship that we see when it comes to, tile work, when it comes to jali work. And that's where we see this real incredible marriage of science, mathematics, and poetry. Omar Khayyam's greatest contribution, though, in my opinion, was his rubaiyat, which were the poems that he wrote, regularly. The most incredible poem that I would like to read out to you is a poem when he's under incredible amount he's getting a lot of flack from the clergy. This particular poem really is of great importance, is because he's just invented modern day cubic equations, and he's got enormous flack from the ulema for being someone who writes mystical poems as well, and who likes his wine. And the Islamic clergy threaten him with the eternal torment of hell. And so he responds with an incredible poem, which I'll just read out. It says, "Thou hast said that thou wilt torment me. Thou hast said that thou wilt torment me, but I shall fear not such a warning. For where thou art, there can be no torment but love. And where thou art, how can such a place be?" So that's Umar Khayyam hitting back at the clergy. And he comes back with geometry. He comes back blazing with geometry, which lights up architecture from the Jali works in India right up to Spain, Central Asia tile work. And so that was the marriage of
in Iran.
Spirituality.
He's remembered as a geometer than a poet, I believe.
So all in all, this was the mind that the Sufis had. And then, of course, in India, everyone talks about the Chishtis and Nizamuddin Aulia and Moinuddin Chishti. And I don't want to talk much about them because they're quite well known. But people have forgotten two Sufis who are incredible. And I'll just, in a couple of sentences, capture their lives. One was Dara Shikoh, who was killed by his bigoted brother Aurangzeb. And Dara, translated the Upanishads in Persian. And the West got to know the Upanishads only after reading his Persian translated Upanishads, which was then translated into French. Dara also wrote the Majma ul-Bahrain, which brought Hinduism and Islam closer.
The mingling of two oceans.
Yeah, mingling of the two oceans. And Abdul Quddus Gangohi, whose shrine in Gango, he was a very unique man because he was incredibly driven by the Yoga Vashisht. And he performed his namaz in different yoga positions. And his shrine in Gango in UP is still a very revered shrine. But anyways,
I think it's very important to point to make, because wherever you are in the Islamic world today, but also historically, the Sufis are the bridge between Islam and other religions. When you go to Egypt, if you go to the Mulids there, where there are great popular festivals where the Copts play a major role. If you go to Nizamuddin on a Thursday evening in Delhi,
yes,
you will find as many Hindus and Sikhs and Christians there as you will Muslims. And this has always been one of the key factors in the importance and the success of Sufism.
Willie, if I may ask you, can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences when you did that magical documentary on Sufism as you traveled through India, Central Asia, and Turkey?
Certainly. 10 years ago, I did a Channel 4 documentary called Sufi Soul. And we had a wonderful 6 months across the Sufi world recording extraordinary music. We started in Palestine and in Syria. We traveled to Turkey, Pakistan, India, and ended up for the third part in Morocco and the Maghreb. And in each of these different areas, we came across very distinct forms of music, because Sufism had not invented a new form of music. It had merely taken on the coloring, the musical coloring around it. So what you find when you go to Turkey is traditional popular Turkish music taken by the Sufis and put to poetry. And this is very significant for the way that Sufis work. Wherever they were, they took on popular belief, which often was not mainstream Islamic. It could be Christian if you were in Egypt or in Palestine. It could be Hindu if you were in Egypt. In India. And it made Sufism open to other religions. It also made it accessible to people for other faiths. If what mattered was the heart,
yes,
if what mattered was love,
yes,
then the kind of the fine detail of dogma and theology was far less important than devotion.
yes.
Therefore, it was a bridge whereby that Sufis and Hindu sannyasis, or Sufis and Coptic monks would find a huge amount in common, and did find a huge amount in common. And when you look at the lives of of leading Sufis. I think particularly in the South Asian context, you often find that they were mixing on a very intimate level with Hindus and sannyasis. A classic example would be Abdul Latif of Bitshah, the great Sufi of Sindh, and he set off with Hindu sannyasis,
Yes,
with a group of Hindu sannyasis, and wrote a whole series of verse, which is, the great masterpiece of Sindhi literature.
Yeah.
Talking about his journeys with sannyasi.
Yes, and so did Sarmad, who was influenced greatly by yogis.
Absolutely, and who's buried in outside the Jama Masjid in Delhi.
Yep, and he was Armenian.
I was, funny enough, I was in Thatta in Sindh a fortnight ago, just before lockdown, 3 weeks ago now, and I went to Sarmad, the place where Sarmad fell in love. In Thatta, which of course was a scandalous story at the time. Anyway, the point being that I think it's very important to realize that Sufism historically emerged out of that in that space between faiths. When Islam erupted into the Middle East in the 6th and 7th centuries, it came into a world that was populated very heavily with ascetics. In the period after the fall of the Roman Empire, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men, disillusioned with the secular world at the end of the Roman Empire, in the anarchy that followed the breakup of the Roman Empire, went and lived in the deserts of the Middle East. And so much so, said several observers, that the desert became a city.
Yes.
And and around the Holy Land, in the Jordan Valley, throughout Egypt, right up to Syria, and across the plains near Aleppo, and throughout the entire region, you had hundreds of Christian holy men living mystical lives, often sometimes in communities, usually on their own, some of them on pillars as skylights and so on.
Yes.
And this was the world which Sufism first emerged in. When Islam appeared in the 6th century, many Christians regarded it as an alternate form of Christianity.
Yes.
Often in early Islam, you find Christians and Muslims sharing sacred space. So, for example, in Damascus, half the church of John the Baptist was given over to Muslims. And for 1,000 years, it was a shared space until eventually, after the Crusades, Islam took it over, and it's now the Great Mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque.
Yes.
But it is the reason, in a sense, that this syncretism, this openness to other faiths, is so central to Sufism today, is that it emerged from that syncretic past, that it was a product of syncretism. And one of the very first great mystic writers of Sufism had been a Syriac hermit, Christian Syrian hermit, Isaac of Nineveh.
Yeah.
And so this openness to other faiths was a very central part of Sufism when it arrived in South Asia, and it was there that Sufism, in a sense, took on, I think, a more central role in the Islamic world than anywhere else. That Sufis outnumbered Orthodox, what you might call Orthodox Muslims, and the shrines were at least as important as the mosques for most of South Asian Islamic history.
And there was always a clash between the Sufis and the clerics. It was always the eternal struggle to kind of to champion the cause of society. While the clerics were more myopic in their thinking, you had the Sufis who were obviously more liberal, more accepting, also driven by exploration. There are immense amounts of writings from the likes of the Sufis, of even Dara Shikoh, urging man to explore more. Whether it's spiritual or whether it's scientific. In fact, in his Majma al-Bahrain, he drives similarities between many concepts of Islam and Hinduism. He says what the Muslims call is Noor, which is the pure light, is Sarva Prakasha in Hinduism. So you have this incredible belief of not just acceptance but also learning from each other. and there was this
And it was
cross-pollination of
exactly
mind.
this which alarmed the more orthodox. And so when Dara Shikoh is trying for the throne, Aurangzeb uses them as an argument against him being an acceptable candidate to succeed his father, Shah Jahan.
Yeah. Well, I'll finish off, guys, with one very short little verse from a favorite, Dara Shikoh. Not very many people know of his poetry, but I had the good fortune to spend time understanding his poetry, and I'll finish this wonderful session with Willie with a little poem from Dara Shikoh, and then we take a couple of questions. And I know Willie might have to rush, but this is Dara Shikoh, Willie and the viewers, just before he's put to death by his bigoted brother, and he says, "The true mystic will enlighten your heart and your soul. The true mystic will enlighten your heart and your soul. He will make a garden from thorns pulled from your foot's sole. Just one burning candle will make 1,000 unlit ones whole."
Oh, lovely.
That is Dara Shikoh, just a few days before his death. But should we take a few questions before you head off, Willie?
Do we still get the bird song?
Oh yeah,
we'll definitely do a minute of bird song after the question.
Let's do the bird song first. Let's do the bird song.
Wait a few minutes, because the sun's just going down, and the birds will be calling in a minute. So they're slightly quiet, unusually quiet at the moment. To keep up with the question.
So there's a question here which says, "Is Sufism still alive in India?"
Very much really? So. Absolutely it is, yeah. There are Sufi shrines all over South Asia, both in Pakistan and in India, and also, of course, in Bangladesh. And they are absolutely central. They take a very different, they have a very different flavor today because of partition. What I find so charming about the Sufi shrines of India and what's so moving is the way you do still every Thursday see all faiths in Nizamuddin or in the Roli Dargah just beside my house.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly moving when given the amount of hatred that is generated by politicians that you see, expressed in the Delhi riots of only a month ago.
Yeah.
When you then go to Nizamuddin and you find Hindus coming in equal numbers and Sikhs and Christians in equal numbers to Muslims,
so
and praying side by side, and a religion that brings people together rather than separates them.
There's a sorry, carry on, Willie. Carry on.
And it's nothing new that there have been those in the Islamic world who criticize Sufism, who say it is superstition, that it's not intellectually rigorous enough. But the truth is, in a sense, I think that there's two very different sides to Sufism. There is the high poetic and intellectual side of Sufism that we see expressed in the writings of, on one hand, Rumi, on the other hand, Ibn Sina. On the other hand, you have Sufism at a village level, representing popular belief, and it's completely true that in a sense it is a full of the possibilities of superstitious simple faith, but there is nothing wrong with simple faith.
Yeah,
it is open to others. Simple belief of uneducated people can be an extremely beautiful thing, and the expression of it with different communities coming together in small villages across India is, I say, one of the things that moves me most of any religious expression anyway.
Sure. There's a question by someone which says, where can they get the translations of Dara Shikoh's work? It's very difficult, but there is a translation that I picked up by Paul Smith called Dara Shikoh, the poet, the prince, and his works. And not only does it contain Dara Shikoh's works, but it also has Sarmad's works. And by God, you know, Sarmad is just absolutely astonishing. So do get Paul Smith's translations of Dara Shikoh's works, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
There's also been an excellent new biography of Dara Shikoh published by Supriya Gandhi, who's been working on this for 10 years. She's a young scholar. She's Mahatma Gandhi's great-granddaughter, but this is very much a book published at the end of a long academic journey. She teaches at Princeton, I think, or Yale. And she's a considerable scholar, fluent in Persian, and I think that's the best currently available biography.
So just two more questions, Willie. One for you, one for me. There's a gentleman who's saying, how and where can I get my hands on the Anarchy right now? So you need to answer that, and then I'll take another question.
Okay, so there's not much Sufism in the Anarchy, I'm afraid, but the Anarchy is available on Kindle as an ebook if you want it as an ebook, and obviously it's available in most countries in bookshops when they reopen after this blip that we're in at the moment. I understand Amazon has ceased delivering in many countries, but they'll be back soon.
And there's another question which I think it would be great even if you get involved in this, Willie, but I'll have a crack at this first if that's okay. The question is, and I think it's a great question, who are the torchbearers of Sufism today? Listen, I personally feel that, you know, everyone has a different opinion on Sufism, which is fine. And if you're a true Sufi, you'll accept everyone's opinion. But my opinion on Sufism is based on the marriage of spirituality and science and mathematics, which the likes of Omar Khayyam, you know, Ibn Sina, Dara Shikoh, these were the ones who brought that out, that kind of incredible marriage. And unfortunately, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, I don't really see any torchbearers of that kind of a Sufi mind currently. And that was one of the reasons why I actually wrote the topic for this discussion out initially as, why is Sufism only confined to shrines and festivals today? Today, Sufism is all about going to a shrine, putting in a mannat, you know, oh, if I get this, I will come and put a chadar on your tomb. Or it is about, if I get this, I will feed 20 poor people. The real Sufism, which was about understanding yourself, contemplating within, and then coming out blazing with science and spirituality, is lost. And during that time, I think it was the golden age of the Muslims, because they were able to marry spirituality and science. And to answer your question, at least from my point of view, unfortunately, I don't see any torchbearers of that kind of Sufism in today's day and age. It's a tragedy. But our master historian, William Dalrymple, might have another point of view. Willie?
So I think you're right. I think there's the kind of the high intellectualism and the high literary world of Sufism is difficult to find today. I mean, there are amazing people around the Islamic world who describe themselves as Sufis and who do write poetry, and you know, I could think of a few in India who but you know, they're private individuals. They're not famous figures like Rumi or Ibn Sina, and it is largely at the popular level of popular devotion that one sees Sufism at work today. But as I say, there's nothing wrong with that. I think I'm very moved by popular Sufism at a village level, and the way it brings, you know, it's one of the few places in the world where you can find religion acting to bring people together rather than separate, and that's something to be treasured in my view.
And just one final question. It's about you know, what I'm currently writing, and if I may just get a minute, I might talk about that, if that's all right. It's a book which is set against the backdrop of three diminishing empires: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. And what I have come to pen down is the story of a craftsman, a Sufi craftsman, who makes his way from Delhi all the way to Spain during this incredible time. And it's the life of the Sufi craftsman who finds himself through Sufism, through poetry and philosophy, as he traverses the lands from Delhi all the way to Spain. And I've tried to grapple with how I should bring Sufism back to relevance. And I thought,
this
maybe
is a
an
novel,
academic book, maybe a...
This is a novel? Or?
Yeah, so it is, and I was trying to put this across, that I was grappling with trying to bring to life how I should tell the story of the lost voice of the Sufis, either through academic writing or through an academic book. But then I realized the larger challenge is to tell this through a character who is sensitive and who is deeply enriched by Sufi art and Sufi craftsmanship, but against the backdrop of highly researched historical background and facts. So it's a fictional character, but set against the backdrop of historical facts and historical research. It's a story of a craftsman who makes his way from Delhi all the way to Spain.
Look forward to that, Moin. Thank you very much. And if anyone wants to see a bit
Thank
more
you, Roli,
of some Sufi music, my series from Channel 4, Sufi Soul, was bought by Netflix and is now available on any Netflix subscription. So if you put in Sufi Soul, it should come up. We had such fun making the series. It was a 6-month journey across many of the most interesting cities in the Islamic world, culminating in the Fez Sacred Music Festival, where some of the very greatest musicians were playing that year.
Willie, sorry. Please carry on, Willie. There's a question for you, but I'll ask you that once you're done.
Sure. Anyway, it's on Netflix. You can watch it this evening. It's got some spectacular music. We've got Rahat Fateh Ali Khan, Abada Parveen. We've got some old clips that we didn't film obviously ourselves of Nusrat before he died. He was dead by the time that we filmed this. But I'm very proud of it, and it shows, I think, the incredible diversity of Sufi music across different Islamic countries. The kind of music you get in Morocco is quite different from the music you get in Turkey, and the music in Turkey is quite different from the sort of music you get in Pakistan. We've had some wonderful, absolutely wonderful. It was a joy to record and a joy to discover. I should also say that the Sufi centers, places like Aleppo and Konya and Lahore, are also some of the great culinary centers of the Islamic world. You see the presenter expand as his travels continue. We ate more deliciously, I think, on this tour than any other project I've ever been involved in.
Fantastic. Willie, just a couple of questions before we head off. Some for you, some for me. Where can we get Sarmad's works? Well, once again, Paul Smith. Please look up for Sarmad's translations. Paul Smith has done an incredible job. You can get that. What am I reading currently? I'm reading on the Girih tile work and Jali work that was prevalent all the way in Central Asia, Persia, and India, and it forms an integral part of my book. Willie Dalrymple, what are you reading currently, and what are you working on currently?
I've just seen a question about Aleppo coming up. Yes, everything that we filmed in Aleppo, the Mevlevi tekkes of Aleppo, and the music of the Al-Kindi consort, everything that we filmed was destroyed and wiped out, not specifically by ISIS, but by the whole combination of government versus. I mean, there were so many different forces fighting in Aleppo, but the Sheikh Kabush, who was the wonderful singer we recorded in his tekke, got shrapnel in his leg. Jalaluddin Weiss, the amazing Qanun player we filmed, died of cancer shortly afterwards, and the tekkes were blown up and the old city destroyed. So it's a tragic tale, but it means that our record in Sufi Soul is the last record of Sufism in Aleppo, and we did we were there for a month, and we did a very comprehensive documentation of it before it went. I should also say that as one of the other things that Aleppo is well known for is lingerie, and it turned out that the main Sufi singer of the Al-Kindi consort, Sheikh Kabush, whose evening job was to be a Sufi saint and Sufi singer and an imam at a mosque, had also owned Aleppo's largest lingerie chain. The view in Syria is that encouraging lingerie among married couples is a great a plus for marriage. Yeah. So he saw no contradiction at all between the lingerie shop and his day job.
Willie, a question for you: which are the other religions in which you have similar strains, like you have Sufism and Islam?
So I think many religions have mystical sides to them. I mean, probably the least well known in India is, of course, Christianity. People often assume, I think, that Christianity is the religion of solidly sort of Protestant, textual, and rational. But the reality is that Islamic mysticism grew strongly out of Christian mystic roots, and across the Middle East, the Desert Fathers contained a whole range of extraordinary Christian mystical thinkers, and then you get throughout the Middle Ages figures like Julian of Norwich or Hildegard of Bingen, who are great mystics in Christianity. You also find it, obviously there are Hindu and Buddhist and Jain mystics too. And Sikh ones, but I think in India people assume that there is no Christian counterpart to Sufis. Well, there actually are, and there's a very rich mystical tradition in Christianity. Anyone that enjoys the complexity of Rumi will enjoy the complexity of Julian of Norwich. And for Indian readers who don't know, haven't explored the very similar visions of Christian mystics, I would advise them to start with Julian of Norwich, who was a 13th century Julian, a woman. She was a woman hermit in East Anglia in the 13th century. Lived in a hermitage where she was brought food by her followers, and had these extraordinary mystic visions. And whose kind of I suppose best known line is "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," which my father was very fond of quoting it.
Willie, what's your next book? A question for you.
My next project is something slightly different. The last 5 books I've written have been in some way or other connected with the East India Company and the way that that moment of transition between the Great Moguls and the Raj. And I'm now going back to the same world I really started on, the world of the Silk Route that I explored in Xanadu, and the world of late antiquity that I explored in From the Holy Mountain, my early books. And this is a book I think provisionally called The Golden Road, which is about the diffusion of Indian ideas out of India in the early centuries of the Common Era. And the way that Buddhism spread through what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan into the Tarim Basin, how Hinduism spread through wandering Brahmins and merchants, through Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, how the Ramayana and Mahabharata spread so far that you now find them sculpted on the rear wall of Angkor Wat. And it is an antidote to the vision of medieval trade as put out in some versions of the Silk Route. People often make out that the Silk Route is this extraordinary road connecting the China with the Mediterranean and Rome. When in actual fact, of course, the second economy of the ancient world after China was India. And it's often forgotten that the main trade between China and the rest of the world was the sea trade, which passed through states like Srivijaya, Funan, and the early states of the Khmer kingdom of Angkor Wat, the early kingdoms in Southeast Asia, through the Bay of Bengal to the Pallava and Cholas in southern India to the Palas in Bengal. And then the overland routes over Gilgit, Kashmir, and through the Khyber Pass up into the back end of China, Kashgar, and so on. And just like Hellenistic culture passed from Greece first to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Turkey, then to Rome, and from Rome all over Europe until it reached Scotland and Finland. You get these classical buildings being built in the 18th century in Norway. So I'm going to be tracing the way that Indian art, thought, religion, philosophy became the so well known that Buddhism became the state religion of China, and that all the kingdoms in Southeast Asia took on Hinduism. I mean, so often when you hear Hindus talk about the ancient past, they kind of posit a mythical past where there was plastic surgery and Arjun's arrows in the Mahabharata were nuclear weapons and so on. The reality of India's soft power is such that you don't, in a sense, need any of these myths. It's so extraordinary, the story of how Indian thought conquered all of Southeast Asia and China, and brought its mathematical innovations to Baghdad. So, Arabic numerals, as we call them in the West, are in fact Indian numerals. The way that Indian mathematicians taught the Abbasid Arabs the secrets of geometry and algorithms and algebra. These are all extraordinary stories, and they, in a sense, they've been split up. There's one story told about Indian mathematics going west, another story told about Buddhism in the Silk Route, and a third story about the Sanskrit cosmopolis and the diffusion of Indian culture to the east and southeast. But to me, I think they're all one. And I think it's an extraordinary tale. Anyway, I'm looking forward to I'm in very early days, and my research is just at the beginning. But that's what I'm up to in lockdown. Thank you very much.
All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Moin. Great fun.
Bye.